name is Paul Contino, and for 18 years I've taught at Pepperdine University, and before that I taught at Valparaiso University, which is very much on my mind these days because I keep looking across Lake Michigan and remembering the students and colleagues, some of whom are here, and the fact that on those sand dunes our kids took their first steps. So they're in California now and Washington, but before I went to Valpo, I'm not going to tell you my life story, but before I went to Valpo, I was at Notre Dame. And at Notre Dame, my very first semester, I had a friend who was a Franciscan brother. He was going to New York. In those days, you could find a bookstore on every corner in New York. And I wanted a book I'd heard about. It was edited by somebody named Tobias Wolff. It was called Matters of Life and Death. And I wanted it because it had some of my very favorite writers in it. Among them, Ron Hansen was there, but Raymond Carver, John Gardner. I really wanted this collection, and he found it. And then he reported it when he gave it to me. I asked the gentleman in the bookstore for help. And then he said in a rather snide tone, "Oh, Wolff, the Catholic." I remember this vividly, and I had no idea. I didn't know your work. I didn't know you were Catholic. And I knew you had good taste in short stories, but being Catholic, I sought out the books of Tobias Wolff, beginning with The Barracks Thief, moving on to the stories, the memoirs. Many of you have seen the film, This Boy's Life. You've read the book, his memoir of Vietnam and Pharaoh's Army, his novel, Old School. Suffice it to say, Tobias Wolff became one of my favorite living authors. You all have these authors, the ones who, when they publish a book, you buy it on the very first day it's published. Do you all have that writers like that? So years later, when I was working on an article on Tobias Wolff for Commonweal magazine, I was invited to meet him in his Stanford office and to interview him, and I was nervous. To me, this was like meeting Bruce Springsteen. I had my tape recorder, and I remember my first words as we were beginning the conversation were something like, "This is a very big deal for me." And he, in his characteristic grace and warmth and good humor, made me feel very comfortable. We had a wonderful conversation. You can still read it if you go on Google. And years later, his wife, Catherine, asked me to write an essay for her collection on contemporary saints. It's a luminous collection called Not Less Than Everything. I recommend it to you. And suffice it to say that Catherine and Tobias Wolff are two people I'm blessed to know. They have 3 children. They have 3 grandchildren. They're just wonderful people. Barack Obama agrees. In 2015, he awarded Tobias Wolff the Presidential National Medal of the Arts. And this was, I think, very well deserved. If you know his stories, you'll probably agree. They're among the most spiritually nourishing stories that one can find. He's also a great teacher. Many of you, most of us in this room, are teachers. In a poll taken on Stanford students just a couple of years before Tobias retired, he was named one of Stanford's 2 favorite professors. That's a wonderful accomplishment. And thank God he's working on a new book, and we're going to hear some of it now. So please warmly welcome Tobias Wolff.
Thank you, Paul. And I just want to say before I begin here how much I have enjoyed this gathering and how nourishing I have found it. And I have also found myself wishing that certain friends of mine who are gone, who would have really loved this whole experience. Andre Dubus, the great writer, my late brother-in-law, Bill Spohn, whose book Go and Do Likewise I recommend heartily to you. This is just a very special time. And thank you, Mike and Megan and all who have put this together. I'm going to read a couple of bits, fairly short, from a novel I'm working on. I hope soon to be finished. It's certainly ought to have been finished long ago. Then I'm going to read a passage from my last novel as well, and then Paul and I are going to talk for a little while, and then I hope to have a conversation with you. The title of the novel I'm working on is Tell Them I Said Something, and those are Pancho Villa's last words. He was on the losing end of a gun battle in Chihuahua, and his trusted lieutenant was kneeling next to him as he was giving up the ghost, and Pancho Villa said to him, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." And the narrator of this novel is in a position where he's having to think about those sorts of things, and he's looking back. It's a retrospective novel. He's a high school English teacher in a Catholic high school that had been a boys' school and then had recently gone co-ed. This first section actually is caught in memory later in the novel than the other section I'm going to read, but to respect the chronology, I'm going to begin with this. In college, he was an actor. And one night, after one of those great openings that they had at the play, the cast had a great party, and he found himself in all the excitement and bacchanalia of that celebration going home with a girl who was not actually his girlfriend. And he's ashamed the next day. He loves his girlfriend. She loves him. He thinks that he should go and make a clean breast. And that is where this takes place. That evening, I went to Charlotte's room to confess. I recited the lines I'd prepared, but it was hardly necessary. Betrayal was written on my face, in my eyes, the movement of my hands, and I knew it. I could do nothing but watch her take it in and see how her mouth trembled and her own eyes went blind as she struggled to understand what she already knew could not be understood. For what reason could I have for spurning the gift she had made of herself once I had accepted it? She had not imagined I would ever do that. The man who would do that was not the man she had offered herself to. But who was he then? I fell mute, seeing the depth of the wound I had given her. I knew that nothing I said would reach her now. She was looking at me through a glaze of pain with scouring, almost impersonal curiosity. It was worse than any reproach. Reproach would have been a relief. Yes, and anger and disgust. Then I understood that I had been counting on her to treat me like the fool I wanted to be taken for, to call me names, throw things at me. I'd gone in to play a scene in a glib, whimsical movie, with myself as the bumbling rogue who'd wandered a bit off the straight and narrow, for which he's perfectly willing to take a few good bumps from a rolling pin and be sent to the doghouse. All, of course, with the understanding that my offense would be thus purged and myself forgiven, welcomed back into loving arms with even greater passion than before. A shallow, safe, conventional script, to be sure, but I already knew how to play it, and I hadn't thought deeply enough to come up with a better one. I was an actor, after all. I was also a Catholic, at least by well-honed instinct. For many years, the soul I no longer entirely believed in had moved to the 4/4 rhythm of transgression, repentance, confession, and absolution. Even in contemplating transgression, I had somehow allowed for all the steps to follow. The sheepish wait outside the confessional on Friday afternoon with the other boys, the subdued, murmurous voice I would use with the priest, Yes, Father, thank you, Father. Then the pressure of the kneeler on my shins as I worked through the prayers he'd assigned me. And at last, the lightness of my step as I left the church and entered the world, already feeling a tingle of restlessness for the next adventure. And didn't my church love a sinner, after all? A lost sheep? The bigger the better, as long as he's sorry later. During the ceremony of infant baptism, we in the congregation are asked to renew our own vows by rejecting the glamour of evil. But where did we get the idea that evil is glamorous? Who taught us that sin, though no doubt regrettable, is the prelude to forgiveness, to the celebration of a soul's rescue? That the worse the sin, the bigger the bash. Because isn't that our narrative? Before St. Paul was St. Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, ruthless persecutor of Christians. Knowing the dark, cruel history from which he turned, we hear in his prayers and exhortations an authority we wouldn't grant to some mama's boy who'd sung in the choir, never a drop took, and just couldn't understand why some folks did the things they did. Then there's St. Augustine with his stolen fruit and his mistress. Bunyan's pilgrim, whose journey to salvation would be pretty small beer if it didn't take him through the Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, the Doubting Castle, and the Valley of Humiliation. Or John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. When he says, "a wretch like me," you know he's not just touching a rhetorical base. He'd been a wretch, all right, and then some, a captain of slave ships. And his hymn would not sound the same to us if we didn't know that. The redemption literature of our own day has introduced a new grading note, a tone of swaggering pride in having been such a bad boy or bad girl, with implied congratulations to God for having bagged such a trophy. At least the old wretches really knew they were wretches. Tax collectors, publicans, the prodigal son, the primum exemplar of selfish, lazy wastrels. He abandons his father and brother to all the farm work, blows his patrimony on booze and dice and fast women, and ends up sleeping with the pigs. He has second thoughts, naturally. So he writes home, boo-hoo. And of course his father says, "No problem, can't wait." Father stands on a hill overlooking the road so he can see the first signs of his son's return and runs to meet him and throws a party in his honor. Slaughters the fatted calf, the world-famous fatted calf, which we wouldn't even know about if it hadn't been slaughtered for the prodigal. Meanwhile, the hard-working brother, who's never had a party, is feeling the death of 1,000 cuts. And when he finally works up the nerve to say something, he's treated like a crybaby. "Get over it," his father tells him. "I see your mopey mug every day. What's to be excited about?" But your brother, that's a different story. He had the gumption to get lost, and now he's found. Drink up. The lesson has not been lost on the rest of us. Who would you rather be? The grumbling drudge, the virtuous stay-at-home whose steadfastness makes him a bore to the very father he serves? Or the high roller who sees the world from a red convertible, is on familiar terms with the wine steward, keeps amusing company, gets laid by showgirls, and then, after a few hunger pangs and a brief period of reflection on the error of his ways, comes home to a hero's welcome and veal piccata. This is all by way of saying that I went to Charlotte's room that night, not only to confess, but to be forgiven. I may even have nursed a hope of scoring points for honesty and for being desirable to other women, which would prove that I was with her out of choice rather than necessity. But at the very least, I would be forgiven. That was how it worked. in books, on stage and screen, in my mother's kitchen, in the walnut pews of St. Brendan's. I had never not been forgiven after confessing, until this night. This picks up later in the narrator's life, and he has had a breach with his wife and has gone to live for the time in his sister's apartment, and she's not there. And one night his adult son comes over to remonstrate with him and to help him think about what he's doing and find a way to go home. And his son says here at the end, "You should go home. Really, Dad." And what did I think of when he said that? Not what he intended. The word Dad blew me right out of the kitchen. Took me back to when he was just a little boy, and I his hero. He'd call up to me from the driveway when he got home with Anne-Marie after nursery school, or a shopping run, or a trip to the park. "Dad, Dad." And I would come to the window of the cramped room on the second floor where I prepared classes and graded papers and wave at him, his big moon face turning red with pleasure. "There's Dad," he would shout, and keep after Anne-Marie until she too had waved up at me, waggling her fingers over an armful of groceries. Then I would blow her a kiss and turn grudgingly back to my students' papers, red pencil in hand. Oh, those papers. Essays by boys who didn't like books, most of them, and wrote only under stern compulsion. Unreadable essays, but I read them, had to read them for duty's sake and our daily bread, jumping up to prowl the room when brought to despair by such offerings as, on Uncle Tom's Cabin, black and white lifestyles in the Old South, or Why I Feel Slavery is Wrong. How many essays have I read through the years? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and still alive to tell the tale. Sometimes, to break the monotony, I've had my students write stories. That presents its own hazards. Over time, I've been treated to handwritten but word-perfect copies of The Gift of the Magi, To Build a Fire, and The Killers, among others. It's been better since the school took in girls. They've raised the game. But only last fall, 3 of the football players in my junior class turned in stories that began with the words, "Little did I know." I decided to treat it as a joke. On a rainy December afternoon all those years ago, my furious pacing brought me to the window, and there was George, still standing in the driveway long after I thought he'd gone inside, gazing down at a puddle. There was a deep sag in the asphalt there. I kept meaning to complain to the landlord, but who thinks about a pothole when you're not actually bagging through it? The puddle was big enough that I could see the ripples on its surface, breaking into miniature combers on the far shore. George, in his shiny yellow slicker, stood pondering this body of water, head bent, hands clasped behind his back. He was, 4 or 5, and already a philosopher, and now it seemed he somehow knew to look like one. I watched him. What was he thinking? Maybe he was mulling over one of those big questions he still trusted me to answer. Do sheep have trouble with moths? Dad, how many kids have to swim to school? Or, the time approaching Christmas, something even bigger. a needling doubt raised by some over-informed child in daycare. Is Santa Claus real? A dangerous question this, the Santa perplex. You either reinforce your earlier complicity in the myths of the season, cheerful and innocent as they seemed at the time, or you tell the bald truth, a truth that will bring you no credit, as telling it will demolish a pleasant and profitable belief while revealing you as a liar for the first untruth you committed and all its corollary fictions. And it will also reveal the entire adult world as colluding in falsehood and illusion. What about the Santa cutouts on rooftops and lawns, the displays in store windows, the TV commercials and magazine ads, the wish list solemnly addressed to the North Pole? Lies? Really? Nothing but lies? Once you've tasted the fruit of that knowledge, you can never go back. If your mother and father and uncles and aunts and teachers and neighbors and babysitters and even strangers can all get together to fool you on this, what else are they fooling you about? Once begun, the list of possible hoaxes is endless, beginning with the jolly old elf and going on to cherubim and seraphim, the cowardice of bullies, American exceptionalism, the march of human progress, divinely inspired texts, and finally, perhaps, the divine inspirer himself, with plenty of casualties in between, not least the moral stature of your parents. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? But really, what kind of father tells his little boy, Santa Claus? Are you kidding? Don't be a sap. Santa's just a way to sell toys and make poor kids feel left out. It was such a question as this I found myself anticipating that day years ago, watching my son in his contemplations. But I soon came to see that George must have a different matter in mind. That is, weighing the pleasure of leaping into the middle of that puddle against the discomfort of wet shoes and the vexation of his mother. He gave the question close study and decided for joy. He went into a crouch, rocking back and forth, fists clenched at his sides, eyes on the water. He gathered himself and jumped. He made a good splash. The water covered his shoes. He stood there a while, then sloshed through the puddle and down the driveway and up the steps to face Anne-Marie. Careful man that I then was, how I admired him. How did we get from that day to this? By what steps did he ascend and I descend? When did the adoring son achieve this goodly height, to look down on his father in a wallow of schoolboy weakness and confusion? Maybe that's purpling it up a bit, but there was a certain adult distance in George's manner this day. Distance and love, and hardest of all to see, pity. Thank you.
Part of the reason you're one of my favorite living writers is you make me laugh out loud. One of the others is David Lodge, who you probably have read, the English novelist. Yeah. But you're also so moving, you know, and the business Thank about you. The children, you know, well, I can hardly wait for the book. I'm going to ask 2 questions, and then I'm assuming, a number of you have questions for Tobias Wolff? Wouldn't you like to ask a question to Tobias Wolff? And I'm sure you do. So my first question picks up on something Angela O'Donnell said. She was quoting Walker Percy, writing is a lonely business, but it's also paradoxically communal. And one of the things that I really liked about Tobias Wolff is discovering things like this article in America about John LaRue, who you knew at Stanford, or the introduction you wrote to an Andre Dubus collection that's been reprinted. Long before I knew you, I remember I was reading Fires by Raymond Carver, and there's that picture of you and Richard Ford, and I dare say you're singing Helpless by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And you know why I remember these things. Anyway, Raymond Carver remembers this. So I wanted to ask you about friendship and writing and how those relationships may have borne fruit in your fiction, or perhaps just stories about authors that you remember fondly and that you might wish to share. You began by saying you wish folks were here like Andre Dubus and others, so I'll pass the mic.
I have been blessed to live among people who care about reading and writing, who care about books, and that has fed my own resolve and my love of writing and literature, the constant exchange of ideas, the excitements about somebody new, and it's such a natural thing really to gravitate toward friends like that. Here's a friend of mine right here in the front row, Ron Hansen, and I remember meeting Ron we've been friends since 1976 when Ron showed up at Stanford as a writing fellow, and I had just finished my first year there, and we were at a welcome party together, and he started telling me about this Western he was writing, which became the great novel Desperados. And he said, one thing I really like about writing this is that I can write like the sound of a bullet banging off of something. He said, I love writing whang, and I thought, this guy's going to be my friend, okay? And we have been friends ever since. And yes, I treasure probably my best friend in the world has been my friend since I was my best friend since I was 16, and it's something. It's been a kind of lifeblood for me. That friendship. It's utterly sustaining.
Yes. Oh, good. Well, thank you. Now, I was so happy when you began with. It was a very funny story of the sin of presumption. I guess we'll have to read the novel to find out if there's any hope in that relationship. Whether she does forgive him. I'm assuming now she doesn't. Is it Augustine that, said avoid presumption, avoid despair? One thief was saved, one thief was damned, looking at Luke. Presumption and despair are both forms of pride. But you're talking about confession and growing up with the sacrament of confession and the imprint that it makes. And just listening to a talk about an hour and a half ago, John Dean was speaking about Seamus Heaney growing up with the sacraments in Ireland, and how formative they were, but yet toward the end, how he was moving beyond those boundaries into something else that John was saying was still very spiritual. What about the sacraments in your own experience, in your own fictional imagination? We saw that beautiful film about Flannery O'Connor a couple of nights ago. They were so important to her. The Eucharist was so central, and the way they illustrated the benediction scene in Temple of the Holy Ghost. Perhaps maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Well, I would have to keep it very simple. It's hard for me to know how to talk exactly about that, except that I must be hungry for it because I keep going back for it. And, in Paul Mariani's reading the other night, he read a poem of his in which he evoked, the stranger that he's following. Yeah. And he said, what else can I do but follow? What else can I do but follow? And I guess sometimes that's just what it is. Like, well, what else could I do? To quote Hopkins, after a while, what I do is me, for that I came. It's almost as if You don't feel there's a choice.
But then he goes on to say, but I say more, Christ plays in 10,000
Yeah,
places, and
exactly.
that's where we meet him. Let me just ask one more question, then I
Yeah,
want to turn to
yeah.
the audience. It's been a tough year, though, to keep going back. I mean, if you're a Catholic. I mean, I have found, I've said this to others, I'll say it here, we're among family and friends. I thought Richard Rodriguez spoke so movingly and hit upon those things. People like James Carroll will write articles saying, well, I don't go anymore.
Yeah.
He wrote an article, I forget where it was, but, but you keep going back. And this is an ill-formed question, but any counsel for those of us pilgrims who are, finding it rugged ground these days?
Well, what is certainly, I can't make theological arguments.
No,
No, I mean, to myself I can't.
Yeah.
And those sorts of justifications that maybe once would have meant more to me, I'm bound, I suppose, to some extent by habit, a habit of mind and spirit, but also my community. I'm closely bound in community to people in my church. We meet in small groups, and this is just so intrinsic to my life that I absolutely understand why the church has become for some a place they don't feel at home in anymore, and I understand it. I understand the reasons for it. Absolutely, it is still a home for me.
Thank you. So I think Mike is going around. Will you?
Yeah, we're in the middle of an audio problem. Hope the camera picks this up. So we just have
One mic.
I like loaves and fishes. Like one microphone amongst the 5,000.
Why not? We can do it. It'll multiply. Good.
Yeah.
All right.
I think we can do this as a family. So anybody have Tobias Reed? I mean, do you have any thoughts about what you've heard? Any questions for really Paul or Tobias?
Yeah, for either of us.
It's a pleasure to see so many phenomenal writers here. I'm a Jesuit, recently ordained Catholic priest.
Congratulations.
I often invoke some of the writers in this room in my homilies and poets as well. And I'm wondering, in the perspective of a writer who goes to church regularly, what do you like to hear from the pulpit? What grinds your gears? In other words, I draw strength from writing and good fiction and good poetry. What do you draw strength from when you go to be nourished at Mass?
I'm very lucky that way. I was thinking, though, of something that that Dana Gioia wrote that tickled me in an essay he wrote about the situation of Catholic artists, and he said something to the effect of, I know that as a sinner, I deserve to be punished, but must so much of that punishment come at church? And I suppose one of the reasons that I do find myself drawn back is that I belong to a parish where where I have a community, and also where I hear truthful, difficult things talked about from the heart. No bromides, no easy piety, but a real wrestling with the situation. If our church is not about reality, then it really is uninhabitable. And luckily, the people that I know and those who I'm able to share this life with are insistent on seeing things as they are in all their difficulty. And that for me is bracing. I need that. Just easy piety doesn't do anything for me. It's empty calories.
That's a word that keeps coming back. Ron, the name of your new book is? In Pursuit of the Real, which comes from O'Connor. Yeah. So, look for that. Been thinking about that. Okay, are we passing the mic, or do we have loud voices? Stand and act. Project, please. There's one. Oh, good.
Thanks, Toby. I love your work, and I love all the work that comes out of the Stanford community. And I knew that you took the place of John LaRue in the MFA program at least. And maybe, since we lost John just this year, you might just talk a little bit about that kind of thing in John's work. Because I think John's work is sometimes overlooked. Maybe that's because I just love it so much and I want to teach it so often.
Yeah.
But there are different styles, different ways of thinking about how Catholicism plays into the imaginative worlds of their characters. But could you say anything a little bit about your own relationship with John and perhaps some of his work?
Well, sure. John LaRue was a teacher of mine and a mentor. I came to the Stanford writing program and was taken somewhat under John's wing, and just to my great advantage. He was the reason I applied there in the first place was that I had read a collection of stories of his called Family Matters or Family Affairs, and there was one story in there in particular that there's still a passage in there that has branded itself in my memory, where a nun named Mother Humiliata ends up committing a kind of suicide by bovine. She runs into a cow, and that's the end of her. But the sentence that I'll never forget was, Mother Humiliata took the cow at 60. When I read that, I thought, what kind of man would write that? And I thought, that's the kind of man I'd like to work with. So he was a great presence in the workshop. He was brilliant. Kirsten Valdez-Quaid, who is also a writer who's participating here in the program, worked with John also at Stanford, so can back up what I say. Ron Hansen, others. But John, he was utterly serious in his teaching and also always really funny. His work is just great. He has a book of stories coming out posthumously called The Heart is a Full Wild Beast. And you probably will have read 3 or 4 of those stories in the New Yorker, one of which was published right after he died. And they're he was dying as he was writing these stories. And they're just wonderful. They're dark and true, brilliant stories. But he was so funny. I remember he taught in a Jesuit high school for a while, and when he was in the Jesuits, and he left and got married later. But someone who had been a student of his in this Jesuit high school said that he shared the classroom with an older Jesuit who was cranky and didn't like John. And that man they alternated times in the classroom, and he would often leave nasty messages to John on the blackboard. So one of the boys in the class, of course it was all boys then, said, well, Father LaRue, why you should leave a message for him on the blackboard since he's in next, and you could have a battle of wits. And John said, I would never fight with an unarmed man. And that was just completely typical of John. Yes.
Since you're telling, is this a microphone? Since you're telling stories, could you tell us just a little about Andre Dubus? I only learned when we exchanged emails a few months ago that you would dine with him and got to know him pretty well. What kind of a character was he? Oh, you're laughing.
Well, Andre, I loved Andre. He was like a brother to me. And one of the things that makes me miss his presence here is that he would say something that would keep everybody talking here for days. It would be so outrageous. And I'll never forget, I was once at he was Cajun, and just absolute, never, he did not have a governor on that tongue of his. And so we were once at a conference Ohio University, and he was giving a talk, and somehow or other, we were supposed to give a reading and talk about our work, but he could never just do that. No, he had to give some other opinions of his, and so he started out on feminism. And I just thought, oh, I don't want to be here. But I was. And the thing was, as he would have said himself, it was actually because of his very high regard for women that he thought that they really shouldn't enter the world of men because men were so horrible, and that they could end up like us. But I'll never forget this sentence he said, and he had this thick Southern accent. He said, well, why? I don't understand why a woman would want to dress in a suit, take the train to work, and tell lies all day. And that was his vision of what a man does. Anyway, he was he was a great writer. I'm sure everyone in here has read his stories, his great stories, A Father's Story, for
that's
example.
the one that's most, controversial in a way. I mean, we've raised 2 daughters now. They're both going to Jesuit colleges. But he makes that distinction. If it was a son, I would have called the cops.
Yeah.
But if it's my daughter, and it's...
Well, I had a real argument with him about it. Do you all know that story?
A Father's Tale?
Story?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what happens, for those of you very briefly who don't, is that this man, Luke Ripley, his daughter is drinking with some others and runs into a boy walking down the road, and is so terrified and guilty that she just drives home and tells her father, but doesn't attend to the boy. And the father goes into this field and finds this boy dying and stays with him until he dies, but does not report anything because it would mean implicating his daughter. And even, in fact, stages an accident himself, pretends that he's gotten into an accident to cover the damage of the car. And at the end of the story, he has a kind of dialogue with God, and saying, yeah, you did that, but
You had a son.
But you had a son. You didn't do it for a daughter. It's different. And and then he goes off happily to feed some horses, and I would talk to Andre about this story because I thought that this father, though Andre, and I really had a difference of opinion about that. I thought he was destroying his daughter's life. I thought that he was depriving her of what she needed to do to rejoin the community, that she was going to be alienated for the rest of her life by this, and that it was that the greatest injury was what he was doing to her. But he said, but you're not getting the point. This is his daughter. And
Do you have daughters?
I do,
You
yes.
Well?
I didn't at the time we were making this argument, but
okay.
so I didn't have evidence. But I certainly understand that this parental desire to cover and protect, but sometimes when you protect, you injure.
That's right.
And it's a very complicated story, though. And it's hard to take issue with on the page because it's a first-person story, and that's what he does.
I'm just going to, unless there's a pressing question, if there is, raise your hand right now if there's a super pressing question. I don't see a hand. So Bullet in the Brain is one of your shortest and most powerful and indelible stories. It's the one that I passed around to friends when I read it in the New Yorker. It's about a guy whose life is blighted by irony. Everything is in an ironic distance. So much so when the bank robbers come in, and one of them says, "Kabish," he just loses it. He starts laughing. Oh, now you're playing Godfather or something, and everything is seen through the lens of art and irony, and a bullet goes through his brain, and he remembers childhood, and he remembers the beauty of a baseball game and the accent of a kid from the South who said, you know, shortstop is the best position they is. I think that's what he says. And they is. This is the word he's recovering as he's dying. I heard a talk today about poverty and Dante. Griffin gave that talk, very, very powerful. You heard it too.
Yes.
Is irony one of the things you try to lose as you get older? You don't want to lose your sense of humor, but is that some of the baggage you try to get rid of?
I know there's a kind of irony that is used to keep everything at a distance, and but I find it survival gear myself. I couldn't live without it. Not to distance myself from reality, but actually to get a firmer grip on it, because the nature of things makes irony necessary.
Yes, no, that's well said. It's the same thing you said about 15 years ago when we talked.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's in that order, yeah. And another question, please. Let's hear. Good, there's one. Please.
So you were talking about how your faith is just innate at this point, and it's, you know, it's habitual, and yet you're operating mostly in a secular world. So you're teaching students who don't believe, and you have colleagues who don't believe, and you're talking to audiences who don't believe. Do you find yourself going through a translation process at all, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and I mean, I was known by my colleagues at Stanford. I've just recently retired, but certainly was known to you know, to have this faith, and I didn't conceal it. I don't know really how to answer that question. I mean, the things I would say to colleagues, I would say unmediated. I wouldn't cushion it or anything.
How do you go about talking about the concepts that you just know innately, if they don't have that innate understanding?
Mm-hmm. Well, with my colleagues, really, it didn't come up that much, to be honest with you. Once in a while, you know, one of them would make some snide comment or something, but it just didn't come up that much. Once in a while, because of the things that I taught in the lecture classes that I taught, once in a while I'd get a comment on a evaluation form saying something like, "Well, I didn't know you needed to be a Christian to take this class," and so that I couldn't help, because, you know, if you're teaching Dante, as I did, if you're teaching, I mean, even James Baldwin in Fire Next Time, he uses, you know, he has the very title is right, and so, you know, you have to make your students aware of where these things come from, and that's not so much our tradition. But I would sometimes find the students a little unwilling to acknowledge the importance of this material that we were dealing with, especially in Western literature and culture. But you hope that they love the beauty of it and the truth of it, and you know, we certainly didn't confine ourselves to that. But, you know, there's sensitivities there, no question.
One more, if there's one in the audience. Is there? Yes, good. Oh, I see them. Good. No, there isn't. Okay. I thought maybe, well then, how are you? There is one. Good. Last chance. Good. Thank you.
I wonder if you could just speak to the risk
connection with faith?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the risk of, at a certain point, you don't want to disappoint people, you don't want to make a fool of yourself, and there's no more public way to make a fool of yourself than to write a book. And you're always worried that it won't be worthy, or won't even maybe be as good as your last, and show yourself in decline, all that so those sorts of things luckily tend to lift when you're actually doing the work.
Yeah.
The work is the cure for the fear but I must say I master it imperfectly. I sometimes feel like, Jacob Marley wrapped in chains, dragging myself to the desk. But it is in the work that those worries begin to lift, and you can actually achieve now and then this wonderful state of self-forgetfulness, and that's when these other worries, these worldly concerns, actually tend to that cloud passes. And then you're there, the difficulty then that you're facing is the difficulty of writing well and to make a sentence better and a scene more vivid. And that's when I feel myself most alive as a writer and an artist and even as a person.
You love revision, you've
Yeah,
said.
I love revising.
Yeah. Polishing.
I wish someone else would write my rough drafts.
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
I
that's
could
the hard part.
But I do. One of the reasons that I probably haven't published more than I have is I hang on to things too long. I just love, nothing in this life that we live is perfect, but there's something, about art that it offers you the illusion of perfection. Someone once described a novel as a prose narrative of a certain length that has something wrong with it. And it's, but what you're really doing is trying to make this thing that doesn't have that's snowflake perfect, it's just perfect and beautiful in a way that life itself denies us mostly. But this is the one thing that offers that possibility, or it seems to anyway.
You used these words a moment ago. I think you've, in your work, given us works that are true and good and beautiful. So if you'd all express your appreciation for Tobias Wolff.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.